this war and sacrificed 1 million soldiers and 2 million civilians. Their lesson is, let's make sure that the Vietnamese people remember this as a heroic war and not as a bad war. There are a lot of Vietnamese people who actually think of it as a bad war too.
I understand how, and I've had this experience any number of times, I understand how our Jewish brothers and sisters get offended when people even come close to comparing something contemporary.
Why can't people say become offended?
And yet, from time to time, I can think
are
of
offended.
Afghanistan, where in the
Get
news people
offended.
say this is getting dangerously close to another Vietnam. When you hear those kinds of analogies, how does that strike you?
Way to change the conversation back
to
to...
remember that this happened in this country.
Sure.
But the problem with Vietnamese people is they keep saying this is a country, not a war. And the rest of the world remembers Vietnam as a war. And that just obliterates just the diversity of the country and how it's struggling to move forward. But the flip side of it is that there's still reason to remember this particular past because the past isn't finished yet. The kinds of wars that we're fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan as Americans are repetitions of what's happened before. And what I try to do in the book really is try to situate the Vietnam War in a much longer history, starting from 1898. I think that what we've been doing in the United States has been going on for over a century. In 1898, we took the Philippines, Guam, Puerto Rico, Hawaii, going to the Pacific, Korea, Vietnam War, and now Iraq and Afghanistan is just a further extension of the same thing, the extension of American domination.
You make reference to Dr. King, who I have said many times, I regard Dr. King as the greatest American this country's ever produced. It is hard to talk about King's life and legacy, and by the way, earlier this week we commemorated the 48th anniversary of his assassination, 1 year to the day after he gave that Beyond Vietnam speech at Riverside Church in New York. You make reference to Dr. King's words from Beyond Vietnam. Tell me, as a refugee, how his words, even all these years later, resonate with you and your family.
Well, I think most Americans prefer I have a dream, or they remember I have a dream. And as a refugee, that's what you're supposed to think of too. But when I read Dr. King's speech in Beyond Vietnam, I thought this is a speech that all Americans need to read, even though it's long and complicated and hard to listen to, because he's basically connecting the things that happen in the United States in terms of racism and class warfare and the exploitation of poor people of color and poor white people to a racist war in Vietnam. So for me as a Vietnamese refugee, what that speech does is that it takes us out of our sense of our own victimization, to going back to this Jewish example and other examples. Everybody likes to think of their suffering as unique, but in reality, sufferings are connected. And if we want to overcome these histories of exploitation and warfare and so on, we can't think of our own suffering. We have to be able to connect it to other people. And that's what I think Dr. King was trying to do in that speech. And it's such a difficult reality for people to hear.
Yeah. I recognize that you don't really close on the death of loved ones the way you close on a house or some other business deal. But has the U.S. closed this chapter in the way that we ought? And if not, what remains to be done?
I don't think America has closed this chapter. That's why with Iraq and Afghanistan, the Vietnam War example kept coming up. And I think it's going to keep on coming up. And the reason why we will never close the door on this history is because how the United States got involved in Vietnam as an extension of its military-industrial complex in this project of global expansion, we're still doing it. So we can't close the door on something that we're still doing, which is why Vietnam keeps returning as a war for Americans.
You tell the story, you mentioned earlier how your parents didn't want their names in the text. But you also tell the story of how while you've gone back to visit Vietnam, as you mentioned where you were born and fled as a refugee, but when you go back, you have yet to go back to the place of your birth, because your father has basically told you are forbidden to go back to that place. Tell me more about your father's laying down the law on that and what that's all about.
I also mentioned the Jewish example in that particular example. Art Spiegelman, the graphic artist, he talks about the Holocaust, and he talks about how his father told him when Art Spiegelman was going to go back to Poland, don't go there because they still kill Jews there. And my dad, we're from this small town in the center of the country, said, don't go back there because these people will remember that you're my son and they're going to persecute you for it, which I don't think is true. But the point is that I've disobeyed my father in many things, including going back to Vietnam, but I can't go back to where I was born simply because, I don't know, maybe he's right. That thought sticks in the back of my mind, and part of it is terrifying to me too, as much as it's terrifying to him. So the past isn't over. Nothing ever dies. It matters even to me.
Do you think you might visit that place when your father's dead? And I ask that because we just referenced, both you and I referenced Dr. King a moment ago. His sister, who's still living in her 90s now, Christine King Ferris, the last remaining member of that immediate King family, has not gone back to Memphis all these years later. Got close a couple of times, I'm told by her, but has never returned to Memphis where her brother was assassinated, even after his death. So I wonder whether or not you think you might be pulled into...
Yeah, that thought's in my mind. You know, I have to confront the fact of my parents passing on, and then a new kind of history opens for me. But I'll tell you something else that I didn't talk about. I talked about it briefly in the book. We have an adopted sister, and when we fled the country, we left her behind, and she still lives in that town. So for me to go back to that town means I also have to deal with that history of how the war divided my family too, and how the path of my brother and myself took one direction, and the path of my adopted sister took a radically different direction. So that's hard for me to deal with.
Readers will see this in the text, but just to give a little bit of how you and your family, in fact, your mother and father, did eventually get reconnected in this country.
What happened was, we came to the United States as refugees, separated to live with different sponsor families, and we came back together after a few months, which to my 4-year-old self felt like a really, really long time. And that was, that was a reunification of the family. And moved to San Jose, California, built a life there, and that's our version of the American dream.
Yeah. And now you're a professor at USC.
Good or bad.
The book that you recall that came out a while ago, The Sympathizer, a novel by Viet Thanh Nguyen, went on to become a national bestseller. One of the 100 notable books by the New York Times in the year 2015. That was fiction. Now he's out with nonfiction. It's called Nothing Ever Dies, Vietnam and the Memory of War by Viet Thanh Nguyen. Viet, congratulations, man. Good to have you on the program.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Up next, Grammy Award-winning singer-songwriter